Buen Camino, pilgrims, and welcome back to the Sacred Steps podcast. I'm Kevin Donahue. On today's episode, we're walking virtually alongside Dr. Phillip Adamo. Phillip is a retired professor of medieval history and one of the world's foremost experts on Catholic monks. Prior to his academic career, he worked as a circus clown in the Ringling Brothers Circus in the United States, where he honed a skill to be able to read people. In his latest book, Pilgrimage for 8, Phillip gathered 8 strangers to recreate a 13th-century pilgrimage across the entirety of France, England, and Scotland. We're discussing this modern-day Canterbury Tales on today's episode of the Sacred Steps podcast. Phil Adamo, welcome to the Sacred Steps podcast.
Thanks very much, Kevin. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. It was such a pleasure to read your book, Pilgrimage for 8, and really start to understand a story that I'm not familiar with. And I wondered if you could introduce for our audience a little backstory on the abbey and the connection to this French monastery.
Sure. Well, as part of my graduate studies and my specialty in medieval history is this very particular group of monks called the Caulite monks. Their French name is Val des Choux, which means Valley of Cabbages. And they are, in fact, located in a valley between, surrounded by mountains in the middle of forests, this very isolated place in Burgandy, just north of Dijon. The Caulites are a very peculiar group in a way because they remain very small. And they only branch out mostly in France and Burgundy. And then in this odd little blip in their history, in the year 1230, they found 3 monasteries up in Scotland, way in the north of Scotland. And you sort of wonder, well, how did that happen? The king of Scotland at the time, Alexander II, invited them to come up. And they found 3 monasteries, Ardhatton, Bewley, and then Pluscarden. The first 2 of those are now in ruins, and for all sorts of reasons during John Knox's time, during the Protestant movement, and other monasteries were destroyed or made state property. And this happens to Pluscarden as well. But in the 1940s, some Benedictine monks moved into Pluscarden and sort of revitalized it. They rebuilt the church, they rebuilt the cloister, and they're on this very long-range rebuilding plan to recover what is a very beautiful ancient monastery that was built in 1230 AD. Pluscarden is in the midst of this building project, and one of the things that I'll talk about in a second is a sort of fundraising plan that they have. This is how the modern pilgrimage came about. But let me tell you a little bit about the ancient pilgrimage, and I can only tell you very little because we don't know anything. It's one of those things where all sorts of conjecture has to happen. And I was asked to be at first a consultant for the modern pilgrimage. And this lovely man, David Broadfoot, who was the pilgrimage creator, manager, said, well, how do we know, what does the pilgrimage look like? We want to try to recreate that for this fundraising scheme that we have. And I said, well, these are things that I think about all the time. And unfortunately, there are not a lot of documents. There's no sort of diary from a monk who was on this pilgrimage. There's no chronicle of when they left, who went, how many went, what path did they take. And so a lot of this is just conjecture. They could have walked the entire way, and that would be wonderful if that happened, and that would sort of reflect what we're trying to do in the pilgrimage. But if the King of Scotland is sending for them, and he wants them to go up there and build these monasteries, he could have given them horses. Maybe they rode the whole way. Maybe they didn't even walk in the UK. Maybe they, crossed at Dover and got in a ship and went all the way around. All of these monasteries are close to the coastline, so it's completely feasible that they just took a boat around and didn't walk at all. Why would you if you had someplace to go? So we know very little, except that at some point, some monks from Val des Choux, the monastery in Burgundy, which is called the Mother House, left for these daughter houses in Scotland. Now, the Mother House and all of the other monasteries, one of the interesting things about these monasteries in the medieval times is that they limited their numbers of monks and a group called conversi, the lay brothers who worked on the land. They didn't want to have more than 30 people total in their entire monastery. Now, this was a sort of critique of other monks and other monasteries at the time. The Cistercians, for example, had sometimes hundreds of monks and hundreds of lay brothers, hundreds. And that allowed them to recover all sorts of land, become great agribusiness tycoons, and accumulate all sorts of wealth. And accumulating wealth is something that is maybe frowned upon by monks who are supposed to be living in poverty. So the Caulite monks in Burgandy said, we're not going to do that. One way that we're going to critique these other monks and become a new kind of monk is to not try to evolve economically. We're going to just live from the donations that we get. We're going to each have little bitty garden plots to grow our food, but we're not even going to have very many, we're going to have 13 monks and then a few conversi, a few of these lay brothers, and that's it. So then you have to think, well, wait a minute, if they've only got 13 monks, how many are they sending to Scotland? They're founding 3 monasteries, so they have to send at least 3. But maybe they want the monks to have company, so maybe there are 2 monks that they're sending. So maybe that's 6. Maybe they need somebody to oversee the whole system and travel back and forth. Maybe that's 7. Or maybe it's 3 each. They don't just want to send 2 because 2 might still get into trouble. You need a third to set apart, set them off from each other to watch. Everybody's now watching the other 2 monks. Nobody knows. I mean, all of this is sort of fun conjecture, but there's no document that tells us what happened. All we know is in 1230, the king of Scotland said, I'd like some monks to come. And they went. And then suddenly we start to get documents in Scotland that say, this lord or, the king of Scotland donated this, and this lord over here donated that, and they start to get donations, and then you start to get some sort of record. But who the earliest monks were, actually, we don't know. And how many went, how many were there, how quickly they expanded, those are all things about which we're very much in the dark.
We're talking with Phil Adamo on the Sacred Steps podcast about his book, Pilgrimage for 8. And Phil, this is where we kind of fast forward from the 13th century to the 21st century, because as part of the fundraiser for the abbey, you and David kind of got together and talked about recreating this original pilgrimage concept from Burgundy to Scotland. And you mentioned no one knew exactly how many there might have been, but you collectively decided on 8, and you gathered this band of pilgrims and began planning this epic pilgrimage from Burgundy to the north of Scotland.
So we started, the planning thinking, well, we could just go, as fast as we could, let's make it to Scotland. But no, we wanted to accomplish some other things. We wanted to experience some of the history of Val des Choux, of the Caulite monks. And we did all sorts of things that wouldn't have happened on the original pilgrimage, which is to say, we went in the wrong direction many, many times, just because of other things we wanted to accomplish. So I mentioned that the Caulite monks expand mostly in Burgundy, and there are several of their daughter monasteries that are right around Val des Choux, the mother house, in Burgundy. And the first one, to get to it, we have to go south. And if you're headed to Scotland on a pilgrimage, you don't go south, you go north, right? No, we went south, and then we went a little bit west, and then we started to go north again, because we wanted to visit these 2 monasteries that are very close to Val des Choux. Val Croissant is one, and Val Saint-Benoît is the other. Val Saint-Benoît is actually an active monastery. It's a convent. There are nuns who live there now, and Carthusian nuns, that's another branch of monasticism. They live as hermits, but they live in community. And these Carthusian nuns are just lovely women who fed us and sang for us, and we've attended mass with them, and just wonderful hosts to the pilgrimage. And we wanted to experience some of the medieval history along the way, so we chose some of the Via Francigena. So visited some places like Laon, which has a beautiful cathedral. We wanted to hit those spots. And then once we crossed into Dover, we, of course, wanted to go to the Canterbury Cathedral. And then we sort of zigzagged across Scotland in some interesting ways, because we also wanted to cross over into the central part of England, where there's another monastery called Prynich. And Prinich is where the Benedictine monks who founded the new Pluscarden, they came from Prinich. And so as part of the entire history, not just the medieval history, but the sort of 20th century history, we wanted to go to Prinich. Then we wanted to visit the other monasteries that also exist in the ruins of Ardhattan and Bewley. So we had to cut across to the west and then back over to the east. And finally, Pluscarden is way, way up in the north, just on the edge of the coast. And so it was an interesting, the logical thing to do if you were really leaving in medieval times to have found a monastery, you just take the straightest route. We absolutely did not do that. We went back and forth, and it was a fantastic time, and we saw lots of lovely sights and got to do some lovely walks. Then as far as how people sort of came to the pilgrimage, where did we come up with this number of 8 modern pilgrims? I think David just started recruiting people through many, many different channels. The monastery itself, Pluscarden Abbey, has a huge mailing list, so there are lots of people that are connected to that community. But they also started advertising through all sorts of Catholic channels. And one of the monks associated with Pluscarden went on to, I can't remember which one's, a Catholic television station here in the United States and talked about the pilgrimage. So there were Americans who were also interested in joining. There was a young American, I think he was 18 or 19 years old, had just finished high school, or maybe just finished his first year of college. And interestingly, his mother thought this would be a good thing to sort of keep him out of trouble, to keep him focused. It would be good for his character to take this pilgrimage. And he became a very interesting member of the group. But people just sort of joined, as you mentioned, a lot of them were affiliated in some way with Pluscarden, a lot of Scottish folks. But even within the group of people who live in Scotland, there was a woman from Germany, a woman from the Czech Republic, a couple of Polish folks who came. And so in some ways, it was a kind of, at least in terms of European nationalities, a pretty diverse group.
Yeah, so you said the word character, as in character building. I couldn't help but, as I was reading the book, Phil, kind of be called back to the Canterbury Tales, because as we're walking through this more than 1,000-mile journey that you take across France, England, and Scotland, we have this really eclectic mix of different personalities and really different roles on the walk. And I wonder if you would share with us maybe one or two highlights that stood out to you from your journey that either made it into the book or maybe didn't make it into the book, as we gathered these unique people together.
Yeah. Well, of course, as a medieval historian, I was very interested in any sort of comparison that could be made to the Canterbury Tales. So just for my own sake, I brought a copy of the Canterbury Tales with me on the pilgrimage. And it's a big, thick book, but I thought, well, I'm going to bring this with, and just maybe that'll be interesting in some way. So here's the story about how all of this really did become the Canterbury Tales with these modern pilgrims. There was a plan we had a cook who traveled with us, who cooked meals for this group, and it became more than just 8 people. When I say a pilgrimage for 8, there was this sort of core group of 8 who did the entire pilgrimage. But we were joined week by week by many different people who joined us for 1 week or 2 weeks. Sometimes the group expanded up to 25 people, and that's what it was like at the very beginning. So there was a cook with us, and this Scottish cook brought with him a big army cooker, this gigantic thing that used butane tanks. And they brought the cooker, but they didn't bring any tanks from England because they thought, well, maybe there's some regulation against that. We can always get butane down in France, not a problem. Well, you can get butane in France, but the cooker's connectors they don't connect to the butane in France. It's a different kind of nozzle. So there were a couple of days where they were trying to figure out, how do we even make the cooker work? We can't connect the butane. And on the very first day of the pilgrimage, everybody's tired. We were staying in lovely places. People put us up in all sorts of odd, interesting places. So we were in a church hall in a very small town. And the church hall, if we sort of laid out our sleeping bags, we could all sort of barely fit in there lying down. And we've had a long walk. We're all exhausted. We're really hungry. And it starts raining outside. So now we can't even sit outside. We've got to stay inside the church hall to keep from getting wet. And the cooker doesn't work. And we're like, well, they've got food. They just can't cook it. And so somebody gets on their smartphone and they say, oh, there's a pizza place that's like an hour away. Okay, so we'll go an hour away, and then we'll get some pizza, and we'll come back, and that'll be like 2 hours. And so now people are just grumpy and tired, and it's pouring down rain outside. And I think, okay, well, let's have story time. I think to myself, right? I'm a teacher. I take out my copy of Chaucer, and I start reading to them from Chaucer. And the very beginning of Chaucer is something called the General Prologue, where he introduces all the characters who later are going to tell stories of the various Canterbury Tales. So the first one is a knight, and Chaucer says, "A knight there was who was noble," and it gives a little description. And I noticed that people in the group start looking around, and there's a fellow named Al, who is a retired general in the Royal Air Force, in the RAF. And he sort of has these knightly qualities, and he was a military man, and I'm describing this military man from the Middle Ages, and people are looking at him, and I'm like, oh, that's weird. And then the next character that's described is a monk. And we have a monk traveling with us from the monastery. So I'm like, well, that seems obvious. They start looking at the monk. And then I describe a cook and a lawyer. And people are going, that guy's a lawyer. And a forester and a sheriff. And they go, oh, that guy's a sheriff. And this is just insane. I think this is so beautiful and funny. There's even a woman, one of the most famous characters in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, is a woman called the Wife of Bath, who'd had 5 husbands. She'd been on all the pilgrimages. She'd gone to Jerusalem. She'd gone to Santiago. And she's this sort of very interesting proto-feminist character. And we had a woman who was also a widow, who had also gone on many pilgrimages, who was sort of the Wife of Bath character. And I thought, this is just insane. And they're just completely engrossed in the story because they're seeing themselves, right? This is a story about people on a pilgrimage. We're on a pilgrimage. They're people that seem to be like us. At least some of them have the same jobs that we have. And they're really getting into it. And I'm, going on, carrying on. And then the pizza arrives. And everybody's like, okay, that's the end of it. That, they all jump up and they all go and ravenously, tear out into these pizza boxes. And that's cool. So I put the book away and I think, well, okay, that was fun. It was a little diversion. It kept people from, getting too grumpy. The food came. Everybody went to sleep. We go the next day. We walk again, another long walk. It's a beautiful day. And at the end of the walk, we show up at the next place and we have dinner. And now the cooker finally works. They've, rigged something up with duct tape and, wire. And I don't know how they did it, how it didn't explode every day. But they got it fixed and they could cook. So we had food and we had dinner. And they were sitting around and sort of recounting the day and, different adventures that people had. And with a big group, I mean, it's interesting. Everybody more or less went the same path, but everybody has some different tale to tell about what they saw or what they felt or that sort of thing. And then at some point, somebody says, what about the story? And I was like, what do you mean? Well, that Chaucer thing. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, sure. So then I said, well, would you like me to, I could read one to you, which is what I'd done the first night. Or I could just tell you the stories because I know many of the stories. And they said, oh, just tell us. Don't read it. Just tell us the stories. So then I told them a few stories, a few nights in a row from Chaucer. And then I started telling them other medieval stories about medieval pilgrims or, various folk tales or episodes of plays that were written in the Middle Ages. And this, I won't say that it was every night, but maybe 2 or 3 times a week, we had story time. And this became very like a regular ritual for the people to sort of gather and hear something. And it also seemed like Chaucer's version of the Canterbury Tales, we were pilgrims telling each other stories.
We're speaking with Phil Adamo about his book, Pilgrimage for 8. I'll link it below in the show notes, as well as some links to the Pluscarden Abbey for those who might be interested in learning a little more about the background of the Abbey. One of the great things, while travel is limited at this current time, you can reach out through the Abbey and light a virtual candle through their website. So you can, if you're looking to make retreats to the Abbey or be a benefactor to the Abbey in any way, we'll link their website below in the show notes. Phil, I want to ask you about the lasting impact to the Abbey itself, because there is a lot of attention that's been brought to the Abbey from Pilgrimage from 8, as you've gone around the world and given talks about the book and those events. What's the lasting impact this pilgrimage has had on the Abbey itself in Scotland?
Yeah, I think there are two ways to answer that question. One is very sort of immediate and economic. It's brought attention to the Abbey, which allows them to apply for grants, for example, from Scottish Heritage or places like that. But also just the money that is raised from the book, a good portion of that goes to the Abbey to support their building efforts to build the women's retreat. So that's just the sort of economic angle. But I think more important than that is the sort of way that it brought the monastic community together, the way that it brought the Plus Garden community deeper relationships with the people that went on the pilgrimage that are, more profound, more long lasting. Certainly the people that were part of this core group of 8, they've been on many walks together. They took a trip to the Czech Republic and visited holy sites there, did a pilgrimage there. They do regular Sunday walks through Scotland and are, these people, we didn't know, none of us knew anybody else. And we're still very close. And of course, I live in the States, so it's not easy for me to just pop over to Scotland and take a weekend walk with them. But I still have very close relationships with them. And so I think that's another part. And then maybe a third thing is just the reports that we've gotten back. David, in particular, who was the pilgrimage director, he's heard from all of the pilgrims about how people's lives were changed on the pilgrimage. And there was a woman, for example, who was recently widowed, and she had sort of withdrawn into herself. And the pilgrimage, I think, according to her, gave her more confidence and sort of brought her out into the world more. I mentioned the sort of 18, 19-year-old young man from the States. He became a completely different person. I will tell you honestly, my initial response when we had this 18-year-old kid on the trip was, and I know this from hanging around college students, I thought, he is not going to have a good time here. This is, maybe the first couple of days, but then it's just like, why am I hanging out with all these old people? He was the only young person on the trip. The next youngest person was maybe 35. And I thought, he's going to get bored. He's going to act up. And in fact, that happens sometimes. He took off and did his own thing got a U-Rail pass and traveled around Europe. And I thought, that's great. That's exactly what he needs to do. He needs to go get in trouble and go to parties that he shouldn't be at and, do things on his own. And that's much better for him. And he'll learn from that and he'll grow from that. And he did. And then the last 2 weeks he came back. And I and some others were going, we're not sure how this is going to work. But he came back and he was like a completely changed person. He would participate in a different way. He would help out with, washing up after dinner and, asking people if they needed anything, looking out for his fellow pilgrims. He had also changed in some profound ways. That his mother, I finally met his mother at the end of the pilgrimage. They came to Plusgarden for this big parade that we had on the final day. And she said, he's changed dramatically in this, this summer. This was so good for him. So there are those kinds of personal transformations that happened as well. And maybe I'll just say on a personal note, this has to be one of the coolest things that I've ever done in my life. And I've done a lot of pretty cool things, but this was something, also one of the best moments for me was on the final day, there's a monk, Father Dunstan, and he and I are very close friends. And he was not on the pilgrimage, but he greeted me as we sort of processed into Plusgarden Abbey, onto the grounds there. And the first thing he said to me was, he's wearing his white monk's habit with a little hood, and he's also wearing sunglasses and a New York Yankees baseball cap. So that tells you who Father Dunstan is. And he looks at me and he says, "You made this. Could you imagine that you would make something like this?" And I thought, well, I don't even know how to answer that. He said, no, you did your dissertation and that was 20 years ago and you did research and then you started visiting here. And now it's all sort of come together in this moment where it's affected lots of people and it's affected the economy of the monastery. It's affected the profile of the monastery and the way that they relate to others. And it put sort of Plusgarden on the map in some ways that it wasn't before. And that's pretty amazing. And I humbly, I can barely hear that I had anything to do with that. I helped out. I had some skills and some knowledge. I'm just thrilled to have been a part of that.
Yeah, Phil, one of the things that I really took away from the book is the community that pilgrimage created among those who were walking it and those who were following it. I wonder if you could talk a little bit, because a lot of our pilgrims today take solitary walks along these historic footpaths, and it's a time of introspection and a time of personal reflection. Surely that takes place when you're with a group, but what takes place as the group is walking and growing together? What are some of those aspects of a shared experience like you detail in Pilgrimage for 8?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's really the thing that interested me the most in writing about this. To go back to how various monks live their lives, there are two basic kinds of monks. There are monks who live in community and try to work things out, and there are monks who live as hermits, and they have a solitary life, and that has its own struggles. Many people say that the communal life is much more difficult and much more important, because they say, if you don't live in a community, you have no chance to express Christian charity. Because if you live in a community, sooner or later, people are going to piss you off. People aren't going to take their turn doing the chores, or they're going to, get in your way or interrupt you. And people are complicated, and people have complicated relationships. If you want to practice Christian charity and forgive your fellow humans, living in a community is the only way to do that. So for me, the pilgrimage offered both of those experiences. And the first is how we walked. And on the very first day, this really surprised me and threw me off, because I had a different picture of how this would work. We did not all walk together. I mean, we all had the same map, and we all had, the same route that we would take, and we all knew the end point where we would be picked up or meet at the end of the day. But on the first day, Al, actually, the knight in Chaucer's story, Al was sort of the guy with the maps, and he was the navigator of this whole thing, and he had taken a leadership role in that way. Al said, look, everybody walks at their own pace. And some people are going to be fast and some people are going to be slow, and that's okay. And don't try to catch up if you're slow, and we're not going to wait for you if we're fast. Everybody goes at their own pace. And do not let your ego get involved in this. Do not think that you need to go faster than you're going. Make this your own Camino, right? This is something that I also hear about, the Camino de Santiago, that people do their own pilgrimage at their own pace. So what that meant was, we would start in the morning, we'd all be together, and there'd be a little map check, and everybody would say, yeah, okay, we know where we're going. And then there was a group of fast walkers. And I would say within seconds, they were over the horizon, and I didn't see them again till the end of the day. And then there was a sort of middle group that sort of took off a little slower. And then there was the old professor. I was always the last person. And at first, like the first couple of days, I think my ego was involved. And I was like, well, I don't want to be the last guy. And then I just thought, okay, I can't do this for the whole summer. I'm going to take my time. Many days, I didn't finish the entire 20 miles that we were supposed to walk. I'd do a little more than half. And I didn't make it. And the day was over. And somebody would come and pick me up wherever I was. So that's part of it. And that was the part of me that was the solitary life, the hermit's life. Because everybody else was faster than me, I got to do all sorts of contemplative stuff because I was walking alone for the most part. And sometimes some of my fellow pilgrims, my friends, would walk slower, and they'd walk with me for an hour or two, and then they say, okay, see you later. And then they'd take off, and then I'd be by myself for the next 6 hours. And it was beautiful. It was fantastic. I didn't mind that at all. I learned all sorts of things about myself. I saw all sorts of beautiful scenery. I got to do all sorts of contemplating the way one does on a pilgrimage. And then, for me, and I think for everybody else, the communal part was, when we come together, how does that work? And you've got to figure out all sorts of things very quickly. And you've got to initiate the new people that have just come on. You've got to initiate them into what's going on. And it comes down to the most basic things about, where am I going to put my sleeping bag? We're in a church hall, and it's just a big open floor, and it's hard everywhere. And okay, I don't want to sleep in the middle of the floor. This is something you learn quickly. I don't want to sleep by the bathroom door because somebody's going to get up in the middle of the night and go to the bathroom. I want to find the farthest corner from the bathroom door and sleep in a corner, because then I've got two walls protecting me. If there's some chairs in this church hall, you could sort of make a little fort, and isolate. You get some sort of isolation. But no matter what you do, when people finally fall asleep, you figure out who are the people who are going to snore, who are the people who have gas, who are the people that do all of the things that humans do. We also had a dog, a lovely dog named Rinus, who was Al's dog, who did the entire trip with us. And Rinus, very friendly, very obedient. But when someone would get up in the middle of the night, that would excite the dog. And then I'm not sure if you can hear this, but there would be this sort of, that's Rinus's tail against the floor. And that would wake you up. Even though the person was trying to go very quietly to the bathroom, the dog's tail would wake you up because it was banging against the floor. He was so excited to see someone. So there's all of that stuff in addition to, so you've got to figure out where you're going to sleep. And then sometimes there would be better accommodations in some places. So and we would say, well, okay, the men are going to sleep on the floor of this gymnasium, but the women are going to sleep in the rectory house of the priest. And there's just enough room. They've got their own bedrooms and they've got showers, and, the men just don't on this trip. And then the next time it would be something different. So it was always, a sort of challenge to figure out where we're going to sleep, who's going to take turns doing what, and just how do you get along with a group? The sort of core of 8 people became very tight and sort of began speaking each other's language and intuiting what everybody needed. But there were constantly new people coming in who had to be oriented to, how things worked, and we had to get used to them. And, and sometimes that was more challenging than other times. And that's just how it is with humans. And that, to me, was the most fascinating part of the story. And you mentioned earlier that there are lots of pilgrimage books, and I could have said, well, today we walked 16 miles. I stopped at these places. I saw these churches, and I had to do a little bit of that, and was fine, wanted to do that. But the core part of the story for me was, what are all of these relationships? What are the sort of relationships with the 8 who are the core group? And how do we relate with other people who are coming and going, or some people who come and go and come back again and then go and come back again? Those are interesting relationships that lasted through the whole summer. And then you see all of these people again at the end when we all meet up at Pluskerton. And even people that might have aggravated you or annoyed you in some way, you're like, oh my God, I haven't seen you since the beginning of the summer. And you're thrilled and overjoyed to see them again. And you've had some kind of shared experience that only they know about because they've been on the trip, and other people who are there to congratulate you really don't know. They sort of imagine, and they're happy for you, but unless you've done it, I think you would know this as well. Unless you've done it, there's no substitute for that experience.
Our guest today has been Dr. Phil Adamo, author of Pilgrimage for 8. We'll link it in the show notes below, as well as links to Pluskerton Abbey, the videos and photographs that Phil mentioned below. Phil, I want to thank you for coming on the show and sharing with our audience this story of modern pilgrimage, this modern Canterbury Tales, if you will, Pilgrimage for 8.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure. It was a great pleasure talking to you.
Thanks, Phil. Appreciate it so much.
Cheers.
On our next episode, we're walking virtually alongside Father Johannes Schwartz. Father Johannes joins us from his hermitage in the Italian Alps to review his new documentary film, Via Alpina Sacra. In the film, Father Johannes walked along the Via Alpina to visit 200 of the most remote Catholic shrines in Europe, including Mount Tabor, which sits at more than 10,000 feet. We're watching the movie together and discussing this touching act of faith on the next episode of the Sacred Steps podcast. Until next time, be well, stay safe, and buen camino.
This has been the Sacred Steps Podcast. Visit sacredstepspodcast.com for episode notes, links, or to contact Kevin. Watch us online on YouTube. We read every comment. Please add your review and feedback. Before you go, tap subscribe to have episodes added to your playlist. Until next time, buen camino.